Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my very great pleasure to host this important session on health and resilience this afternoon within the context of the Respond Virtual Symposium. Welcome to everyone. I do believe that when this is over, you will realize you made the right decision to be here today. A lot has been already said on the topic of resilience. So my introductory comments are going to be brief. I just want to underscore the the highlight of the session, which is the focus on resilience. And this is such a refreshing shift from focusing on vulnerability. Of course, this is not to deny that there are challenges inherent in a crisis, um, but the focus on resilience that this Respond Symposium is inviting us to have as a pathway to effective policy formation allows us to identify the power that is uniquely located within a cultural space and a perspective that I might say is necessary for full nationhood. So, our focus, our view on resilience will allow us to identify how our nation can recover from a hit or the hits that are inevitable in modern life without a net negative effect. And because of the direction, the very progressive direction in which resilience takes us, I think that today we might be able to identify the possibility of not only returning to baseline after a difficulty or after encountering difficulty, but with the integrated focus that is being encouraged today, I dare say that we might be able to identify pathways to thriving, which would be finding oneself or finding our nation, finding communities in an actual value added position, recovering not to baseline, but beyond baseline, thriving. So the focus on resilience is very encouraging, very positive, and indeed an energizing and motivating one for us today. The way that this panel will ensue is that there are panelists who will contribute to a general discussion around the topic of resilience and health. We have three panelists who have been invited to make brief presentations on the topic. So at this point, I am going to invite Professor Eldemire Sherrill, who will be our first presenter for today within the panel. Professor Sherrill.
Good morning, Dr. McFarlane, and thank you very much.
Good morning.
As everybody would no doubt realize, my presentation clearly is to focus on the older age groups and resilience. And I too, like you, am very glad that we're focusing on resilience. And I think that no other group probably has had as much resilience and brings as much experience to the whole issue. We know the track record of older people and resilience, especially when it comes to disasters and that sort of thing, basically because of their past experience. And that is the key difference with COVID-19 as we look to COVID. As one looks in the national arena, sometimes after disasters, you see older people saying, well, I went through this in 1995, this happened to me and I have rebuilt my house, etc. COVID's brand new, and there's no real experience for anybody to bring to it, and certainly nothing to build on and nothing to work with, which I think is what creates fear certainly among older people. But it also means that we can work with it. And the presentation before spoke about grief. Let's add fear to that. Because I'm already getting from several of my patients, don't worry, we're not coming out even when we're told. You have some want the stay-at-home order lifted. Others are saying, well, it doesn't matter if they lift it. I'm not going anywhere until I know there's no cases. So it's a whole new ball game that we need to work through and think. When resilience is determined and certainly depends on an understanding of situations. You understand if there has been a stroke or something. You understand if there has been a burglary. You can know what you are working through. And with COVID, that's not there either. And it's very interesting as we go through this and we talk about how to build this resilience and to really, it's talking about building an understanding. I was quite surprised. I thought we had gotten across the message for the need for the stay-at-home order in terms of chronic disease and immune systems being a little older and therefore not as efficient, until an older person said to me the other day, but if my chronic disease is under control, I'm not at risk. And there was not the concept that, but you have had the chronic disease or you have been a smoker for 50 years. That concept was totally lost. I suppose it's a bit like the plumbing in your house. After the pipe start to wear and tear, then you're going to get leaks. And I was a little surprised 12 weeks into the epidemic to realize that we still did not have a full understanding of why COVID. Which leads as we look to resilience and how to build it, how to get people to take from their past experiences their knowledge of resilience, their understanding of why they are resilient. Sometimes they don't know the word, they're just doing it. We have to identify the problems. The speaker before did identify the important one of mental health, and Prof. Abel is here, so he will join it. But for older people, or he will address that, I'm sure, for older people, there's also physical. Many of them have been at home for 6 months and they have chronic diseases. Yes, they have been getting their medication. Interestingly enough, the one survey that we have been able to do before the end of any of the restrictions was, has it affected healthcare? And the answer, interestingly, has been no. I thought it was going to be yes, that we've missed appointments. It was pointed out to me, of course, that they've been given long appointments. So they haven't missed it because it's not the usual 3 months. But I have also seen in the 3 months, I had a patient, for example, this week who came and I think has had a heart attack. But stayed home with the problems because he didn't want to go to an accident and emergency. So for us with older people, there are going to be physical issues that need to be sorted out, leg ulcers, etc. Very interestingly, the survey, and we have 300, we've only analyzed 20 or so, so it's not a large sample. As I said, I went through them and healthcare has not been an issue. Food has been an issue, not the availability of the food and supplies. They don't like relatives buying their meat and their potatoes for them. They want to choose their own food. So it has not been a financial issue. So as we look to build resilience, we need to recognize what the concerns have been. We did suggest to some have the relative send pictures from the supermarket. So as we consider resilience and with any disaster, because we're using COVID, but it could be a hurricane, it could be an earthquake, and I think the general thing is how to cope with disasters. Don't forget H1N1 is still on our horizon, etc. And we have to think about the capacity to remain stable in what is going wrong, the loneliness, the unsure of what's next. And remember, when you tell them to stay at home, everybody is watching television on how many old people are dying. So there is a great fear among the old people, which is keeping them at home, which is not a bad thing. But if I get it, I'm going to die. When Minister reported last Thursday, one of the people coming in who was positive, but not positive until he had been at home for 2 days, of course, gave it to an elderly mother. So that sort of reinforces the thing. The capacity to return to stability. Fear is a big thing. Finance for older people. Today's headline tells you that remittances are down 1 point something billion. That's going to impact older people. And of course, the chronic disease exacerbation. Flexibility, as part of resilience, we all know is one of the capacities. Flexibility is not a feature of older people. So that is something they'll have to be taught. And they like things in order. We like things in order. We don't like when the natural order is disturbed. So, the supermarket is 9 o'clock on a Thursday, this is that. So it's not when you are available as a grandchild to take. So there are challenges, but I think that our older people have responded, and I think we can learn from them in terms of why did they take the instructions so literally, and we can help to build on that. And I think that's my time. You're muted.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so thank you for your enlightening comments, Professor. From living and working and understanding the elderly, you've allowed us to view the situation of recovering and being resilient in COVID from their perspective. And there's a lot for us to discuss. Just so that the attendees know that we have Lieutenant Henry monitoring the chat, so you can enter your questions or in the chat as we continue. Our second presentation is going to be by Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis. Dr. Lewis, welcome.
Thank you. And hello to everybody. Can you see something up on the screen?
Just your name at this point.
Okay. I'm trying to share the some content. Anything yet?
No, it hasn't changed yet.
Okay. Let me try it another way. But in the meantime, good morning to everybody who is present. For me, it's afternoon. And I'm hailing you up from Wolfville, Nova Scotia. I don't know if there is anybody who has been there. I am currently chaplain to the students at Acadia University. I'm hoping you're seeing something now.
Yes, it has changed.
Right. I'm chaplain to students at Acadia University. And I came in, I started the first Monday in March, and in 2 weeks, we had a complete lockdown. And I had to find a way to provide spiritual care for students who were approaching the end of the semester, final exams, and all that goes with it. So I come to you from that immediate personal experience. And prior to that, I've been for 4 years in the hospital system in Nova Scotia as a hospital chaplain and student. So I'm happy to be here and thank you. I'll be in this presentation using aspects of the work of chaplains in the Ministry of National Security in Jamaica as the point of departure for this discussion on resilience through spirituality. And I invite you to engage your head and your heart. And want to start with inviting you to hold a little meds with Peter Tosh.
my King. Is my life and my salvation. So who can I fear? Is my guide throughout this creation. So whom shall I?
I hope everybody did sing the last Jah is my keeper, right? And I invite you to just relax and, as I said, engage head and heart, and perhaps think a little bit about how you nurture your spirituality personally and what that may have to say to us here in the meeting. We need to look a little bit at the Jamaican context, because in Jamaica, religious affiliation and spirituality are widespread. You have a table before you. Are you seeing it okay? I think I shifted something. Right, is that better?
If you can hear me, Rev, maybe if you put your PowerPoint on presentation mode, then we can see the full screen.
Okay.
So at the bottom, at the very bottom of the screen, if you go to the right of the open book and click the next one. Yes, click that one.
Wonderful, because that's what I wanted to see.
Yes.
Yeah, so from the Encyclopedia Britannica, but anybody in Jamaica would know, we are people for whom spirituality is really important. And even though these figures show that only about 21.3% of the population say they are not religious, there's evidence that a lot of people, not just in Jamaica, but here in Canada and other places in the world, are describing themselves as spiritual but not religious. Or in Jamaica, they would say they believe in Christianity but not churchianity. So people connect with a higher power, connect with something larger than themselves, but are not necessarily wanting to be part of a religious organization. And that's very important when we are looking at spiritual wellness. One army journal defines spirituality in this way: one's purpose, core values, beliefs, identity, and life vision. These elements, which define the essence of a person, enable one to build inner strength, make meaning of experiences, behave ethically, persevere through challenges, and be resilient when faced with adversity. An individual's spirituality draws upon personal, philosophical, psychological, and/or religious teachings and forms the basis of their character. I put the question this way: spirituality for surfing or sinking? I like the image of surfing because the waters can be quiet or the waters can be turbulent. And the surfer is someone who is skilled at feeling the movement of the wave. And based on their surfboard, they can keep upright, they can move with the waves and actually have fun, even though the situation may be challenging. But if you're not sure how to surf, you could sink. And if you can't swim, you know you're gone. So I use that as a metaphor for pointing out that not all spirituality is good. There is such a thing as spiritual abuse. There are manipulations that are used by people who are spiritual leaders, And I feel that it's important for us all to remember that not everybody who says, I am spiritual, or I have a gift, or I have powers, is to be trusted. We have to look at the whole picture. And if there is any sense of exploitation, if one cannot ask questions, if there is no accountability to any other authority or committee, those are red flags. So probably one of the most famous in the Caribbean region was Jim Jones and the folks in Guyana. And nobody now wants to drink any kind of Kool-Aid, literally or metaphorically. So you should have space to be yourself. You should have space to grow. You should have space to think and question, and the spiritual leader must be accountable. As has been said in the documents and mentioned by Professor Eldemire Shearer, we are living in a situation where COVID-19 has come on top of already pre-existing situations and stresses. It was Dr. Peter Weller who many years ago said to me that in Jamaica, we cannot talk about post-traumatic stress response because we are all suffering from multiple traumas. And that conversation was somewhere between 2010 and 2015. So if you think of all of what is happening, we have had a number of things happening simultaneously, things added to them, and we're not really getting a break to say, well, it's a critical incident that is over and done with, and now we can go into post-traumatic stress response and we can be treated for post-traumatic stress. Things seem to be coming at us every day. In a continuing education program at a First Nations college in Winnipeg, there was a very interesting perspective on trauma that I want to share with you. First of all, they prefer to use post-traumatic stress response because they would say these are normal responses to abnormal situations. But the proposal was that we are suffering, not only First Nations people here, but I would submit in Jamaica as well, from multiple traumas. So there are a number of traumatic events going on, and I include in that some of the news reports. So you hear about things happening to people, things happen to you, we locked down in COVID. Then you have the post-traumatic stress response from critical incidents that directly or nearly affected us. And these things, I won't go into the discussions because you have psychotherapists, but there's also secondary wounding in which institutions, caregivers, and others to whom the trauma survivor turns for help disbelieve the victim, blame the victim, stigmatize or judge the victim, or deny promised services. Then you have vicarious traumatization. I personally did not watch the video on George Floyd. I didn't think I needed that in my head. I know what happened, but even so, I think a lot of us have just felt traumatized from knowing that over 8 minutes a knee was in a man's neck until he died. Then you have system-induced trauma, which is perpetrated by a system like medical, institutional, government, an agency, an organization, or an individual or a group. Then you have trauma-based internalized oppression, what they call lateral violence, where somebody steps on somebody's head and they step on the next person's head. So your boss steps on your head, you beat your spouse, and the spouse beats the children, and the child kicks the dog. Then you have traumatic bonding, where sometimes a victim or group of victims will bond with the perpetrator of the trauma for some sense of control. And here's a big one that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to, particularly Black people in the Americas and Indigenous peoples, and it is intergenerational trauma. Some of the stuff that's coming down as culture is not culture, it's trauma. And so even work has been done with genetics that show that the trauma is traveling from one generation to the other. So Holocaust survivors and residential school survivors in Canada are two groups that have been identified. I took some time with that because when we're talking about spirituality and when we're talking about resilience, we need to get a picture. And the picture that I'm seeing is that we are not dealing with a discrete critical incident and then we can move on. All of these things are happening at the same time. And so a little look at the organized chaplaincy services in the Ministry of National Security. In some of these services, there are paid chaplains as well as volunteer chaplains and people who offer peer support. And all of those systems have implications for how spiritual resilience is fostered. So first you saw the Jamaica Defense Force. Let me just go back to that one. The bottom right hand, you will see Jamaica Defense Force Chaplaincy was live. And that's because the Jamaica Defense Force Chaplaincy has been streaming live, as have many other congregations, to try to reach people in the COVID lockdown. So how do we use the technology? What are the limits of the technology when only 10 people can go into a church service when there's a funeral? All of this has implications for the way in which the spiritual resources that we normally draw on are available, challenged, and as I said, there may also be opportunities as we go into COVID-19. Jamaica Constabulary Force also has a chaplaincy services branch. They brand themselves as providing spiritual and emotional support. And from the website, it says the chaplaincy services branch offers holistic care that focuses on psychological, emotional, moral, and spiritual needs of all members of the Jamaica Constabulary Force, auxiliaries, families, within a context of trust and confidentiality. We also have the Correctional Services, Department of Correctional Services. And the Department of Correctional Services have a very interesting approach talking about a day in the life. So whereas the other two are dealing with government employees, in the security forces, the correctional services are dealing primarily with prisoners. So issues around rehabilitation, what happens to prisoners in COVID-19, when sometimes even the volunteer chaplains are not allowed in, and there are serious restrictions and people were in lockdown before. How do they cope? I like this quote from an inmate. Rev, last evening I was about to do something dangerous in the dining room. As I lifted my hand, I could hear your voice saying to me, this is not the right approach. God is depending on you. Rev, I know I couldn't let you down, so I walked away. When I woke up this morning, I felt good that I overcame the temptation. And there's another story of a bag juice man who had been an inmate who had come out, who saw the chaplain and gave her a bag juice as he thanked her for the support that he had received and the way in which she had dealt with him in while he was imprisoned. So generally speaking, in terms of spirituality, there are key themes, and COVID-19 has given people a lot of time to think about their mortality, a lot of time to reflect on their lives. And the anecdotal evidence I have for Jamaica and Canada is that people who wouldn't normally come to church are tuning into the online services, Bible studies, chats, whatever it is the churches have to offer, trying to connect and being forced now to look at, okay, if I get COVID and I die, what? All of the things that I used to be able to do, I can no longer do it. What's meaningful? What's important? what was I doing that I didn't need to do? So key themes in spiritual care are what the philosophers would call existential themes: relationship to self, others, to the wider creation and the universe, relationship to God, spirit, a higher power, purpose and meaning in life. What is life all about? How do I deal with suffering and death? Why should children be killed? Why should people get cancer and die? Why should the good people suffer? And sometimes it looks like the bad people get off scot-free. And what am I going to do what happens when I die? What happens when I die? How do I understand my life in relation to the reality of death? And now with COVID, we have lots of time to think about meaning of life, suffering, and death. And then there are issues of uncertainty and liminality. What we know, what we have so far is that we don't know. Where I am at the university here, the phrase is prepare to pivot. So we are planning to come back with a hybrid model, but we know if there is an outbreak in October, we're going to have to lock down and go back online. People are going to have to be isolated and so on. So how do we deal with uncertainty? And to go back to my image of surfing, it's not solid ground under your foot, it's water that's moving. That's the feeling. And how do you live with the in-between? Will I get back to work? When will I get back to work? If I get back to work and I'm at home with my thoughts, and in some cases, the children eating down the house, and the teacher expected me to be a teacher on top of everything else. And then there's the question of hope. In spite of all the difficulties, what hope is there? Values and ethics are part of what we have to look at when we deal with spirituality. And I would submit that the African heritage in Jamaica and our family structures are important elements in the shaping and nurturing of our spirituality.
I'm going to start with one of my favorite poems because it's so simple and that's what it says. But in the village where I grew up, my mother went away to study nursing and my father was working in town, so I was with my grandmother and my grandaunt. And they used to sit on the little veranda up in the mountains. And this is what they'd say to me. The simple things of life, my dear. The simple things of life. She rocked the rhythms in her chair, brushed a hand across her hair, miles of travel in her stare. The simple things of life. A home me corn and the back ain't gone. I plant me peas and arthritis ease. The simple things of life. Leaning back, she wiped an eye, read the rain signs in the sky, evening's ashes in a fireside. Simple things of life. I'm going to start with one of my favorites.
I won't go much into Binta Breeze's poem, but I want you to think about what she said. Mother gone away to study to be a nurse. She's left with grandma, but grandma is passing on some wisdom. What's happening in that shifting of children? What's happening to the family systems? And where is it that wisdom is being passed on? Not only in the home, but are there other spaces? And so I think that as we look at the whole of government, I want to emphasize the spaces where spirituality, where ethics and morals are formed, and how it is that the different government agencies, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, and so on, interact with these systems: the family, the school, the workplace, the church. To go back to the example of the security forces, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, for example, has a number of station pastors who are volunteers and who work with people in the stations, who do work within the communities. How can government agencies and departments and ministries make use of what is within the community in terms of volunteers, and to be more mindful in terms of their interactions with these different systems as places where spiritual resilience can be nurtured. So another army source put the advantages of nurturing and having a living spirituality this way. They say it gives you hope and optimism, decreased incidence of depression, lower suicide rates, less anxiety, lower incidence of alcohol and drug abuse, greater marital stability, less risky behavior, and longevity. Well, if this is what they figure for the army who are out on the front lines, then those of us fighting life might want to take heed. As I noted at the beginning, we are dealing with intersecting, overlapping, and ongoing systems of grief and trauma. And therefore, as we look at the risk factors, the kinds of policies and strategies, the whole of government approach, I want to suggest that these areas may be useful to take into consideration as the group's work. The question of recruitment and qualifications of staff and volunteers. At this time, most of the chaplaincy services in North America would want the chaplains to be trained not only in the basic academic work in theology, but also in clinical pastoral education. And for hospital, army, police chaplains, qualifications, even one in clinical pastoral education, is important. The resources. Do the staff and the volunteers who are helping in spiritual care have enough resources? And we have to look at those resources and how those resources can be shared. We also need to be systematic about retooling. This is lifelong learning. So I am not sure, do army chaplains, police chaplains, hospital chaplains, correctional chaplains have set sabbaticals to go away? Are there resources to help them with funding? Is there funding to do upgrading for the volunteers? Do they have clinical supervision? After you finish with the people who have been shot and killed and their families, and you're doing that day after day, when we can't have the big bashment funeral anymore with COVID, and you're carrying all of that stress plus your own stress, what is there to debrief the chaplains, the peer counselors, and the volunteer chaplains, for argument's sake? And then research. And I would suggest that for research, we start with what already exists. We have a lot of pockets of very good practice all across Jamaica, but very often we are reinventing the wheel. So I know, for example, I was part of it, that the Ministry of National Security, somewhere about 2018, did a 2-day workshop on post-traumatic stress with clergy persons working in some of the most tense areas in Montego Bay and in Kingston. It was well appreciated. There is work that was done by one of the inner city schools where they were taught meditation, behaviors improved, and grades improved, and children were much calmer. So those are just 2 examples, but there's a lot of experiences we have, but we have not been able to carry it forward. And then some research too about to go a little deeper into people's spiritual needs. The evidence I've seen from psychotherapeutic work, on my own experience and others, the culture is really important. Rasta, revival, everything African is bound up in who we are as Jamaicans. And there is a lot of wisdom in the dance, in the singing, all kinds of things that are involved in those rituals, in the drumming, in the music, the content of the music that can help. And then I would say also referral. Not only do the chaplains and the spiritual care practitioners, but the other people need to understand how to do basic spiritual assessment. And I don't mean you have to do a full thing, but can you figure out, if you're a line manager or a friend, that the problem this person is having is spiritual? They can't find a purpose in life. It may be mixed with the economic and the psychological, but maybe the main thing is they're asking questions. What kind of God is there when all this wickedness happened to children? You know, that's a spiritual question, not primarily a psychological question. So I think we need to get better at referring, and then for the clergy persons and the chaplains, we also need to be trained, and some of us are, to say, if I see a certain number of things happening, this may indicate, for example, clinical depression, and prayers alone not going to do it. So we may need to be able to refer that person to somebody who can do a proper diagnosis and treatment, even as we integrate the spiritual part of it. So I know I'm finished. So I will leave you with Sister Pat and encourage you to nurture your spirituality however it is appropriate for you.
I know the Lord is my shepherd. He may have me to lie down in green.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Marjorie Lewis. I think that your presentation just reminded us of the resilience of the Jamaican identity, that no matter how far north or east or west or south you go, we can always draw on aspects of our Jamaican traditions and the core of us in order to infuse our spirituality and keep us on the path to well-being. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and so we are going to continue our presentation, the third and last of which is from Dr. Olivia Rose Esperance. Welcome, Dr. Rose Esperance, and please, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mack. Good afternoon, everybody. I am happy to be here, and I would be trying to attempt a sprint, even though nothing about resilience is a short run. So I'm going to be setting my timer so that we are within the time of a minute. So I'm sharing screen now. Let me know if you can see my screen.
It's not there yet, Dr. Rose.
There yet? All right.
Okay, well, we're seeing you.
You're seeing me still? I'm pressing share. I don't know what's happening, but
okay,
great. So
okay. And while you do that, okay, so it's coming now, and we'll just remind the participants to enter their questions in the comment section, the chat session, so that we can address them during the Q&A. Okay.
You're seeing?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say a big thank you to the Ministry of National Security and the JDF for having this symposium on resilience. And even though we don't necessarily like to talk about vulnerability, I will be asking a question later in the presentation. So resilience really is just about ordinary magic, as the literature suggests, because it is really about looking at what we do daily in different ways and from a different angle, and trying to find ways to be more deliberate so we can create better protective frameworks for operating in life and for empowering ourselves and each other. So I am a sports psychologist by profession. So my take on resilience will take a sports kind of approach. All right. So let's the magic begin. So I'm gonna ask you, which one of these athletes do you think um, is vulnerable or resilient? Athlete A or athlete B? Love to see your answers in the chat after the presentation, since I will be the only one talking at this moment. But be sure to write down your answers and be true even if you happen to get it wrong. All right, so athlete A is shy, never achieved a personal best this season, felt like giving up, experienced being booed, and did not compete for a year after that. Athlete B, on the other hand, is a volunteer, willing to try after being defeated, eager to improve performance, and confident, and is of the belief that they can do better. All right, you can keep your answers. I think I will share the answer at the end, but I'll say this, that both athletes are resilient. And we can have discussions about that at the end. So I won't tell you what resilience is, I'll tell you what it is not. So according to Dr. Maria Cook Hariva, resilience is not hard and tough. It is not about being invincible, even though we would like to think that. It is not about not being vulnerable, actually. And it is not something that we don't have, or we do have. We actually have resilience based on circumstances. And I have added what it is not by saying it is definitely not an overnight process, certainly not a 100-meter sprint, and it is built over time by overcoming difficult circumstances. All right, so I'm going to be spelling resilience to keep it within the time here. So the R I have chosen for R, I have chosen recover. Okay, so, but in order to recover, you have to be in a fight, you have to be doing something. And of course, as you can see the image on your left, so you have to get in the risk. And it is impossible to talk about recovery if you haven't taken risk. And I am sure members of the military know exactly about risk taking. And life on a whole is a big risk. So remembering, sometimes the thing about risk is that you remember what is bad about it and you try to avoid it. And the R again would be for recovering from injuries, and in this case, a crisis. And, recovering from harm, from pain, from humiliation. Those are some key elements of building resilience. And ultimately, it is the positive adaptation in the face of high-risk situations and the hope of coming out on the other side of thriving. I thought I heard Dr. McFarlane mention that earlier in her introduction. So my E is for emotional reaction. And the thing about emotional reaction, especially from a sports perspective, is that most of the mentally tough athletes have one common trait, and that is emotional stability. So emotional reaction is very important. And as Maya Angelou says, you may not be able to control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. So emotional reaction to a particular situation, and in this case, COVID-19, can be positive or negative. And it is really about how you are going to respond when things are unfavorable. Athletes is when they lose, when they're injured. For a coach is when the team is relegated, and so many other things. And as a result, experiencing or living through a crisis, a pandemic such as this one, it's really going to be based on your emotional reaction. Will it be negative for the entire period, however long or short? Well, it's definitely not short, however long this lasts, right? And how are you going to respond? And that's why it's important to train your attention muscle. And as we talk about training in sports, it's the same thing. You practice and refocus on how you want to respond in negative circumstances. These are also ways in which you build your resiliency muscles. And of course, identifying the emotions that work best for you, which emotions help you to bounce back and get back in the game and be ready to thrive and live. So we are at S, and I've chosen S for strength focus. You know, sports people, you need to be strong physically and mentally and emotionally. And persons who experience more trauma, though, and more loss, especially during these times, are more prone to negative outcomes. And in the face of adversity, the aim is not to strip the person of their strength, but to highlight areas in which they are already achieving what they are good at and can continue to be even better at. Focusing on collective strength, we are a very humorous set of people, sometimes to the disdain and total disbelief of others, because we seem to laugh and make fun of just about anything. But that's also part of our way in which we cope, and focusing on the things that are good about being collective and what we can learn from each other are ways in which we tap into the strength focus of resilience. Suffering is another S word, and this is a part of life. And as a result, again, it is going to be the fittest that survive and being. Another S word that I want to look at real quickly is paying attention to what's, pay less attention to what's not working and try to find strategies advantageous that give you the winning edge. Strategies which I will include in words. You will hear them as I go along because I'm just at the first I and I see my time going away, right? So I would be individual, understanding self. And for athletes, I usually encourage them to be very self-aware, know what your emotional triggers are and how to deal with them. So create your own survival kit in terms of what works best for you in difficult times. Because it's very easy to know what works for you when things are good. And according to Irvin Yalom in his book, Staring at the Sun, Overcoming Terror, of our mortality happens to shape so much of our life goals and our resilience. Therefore, as the individual and being self-aware, I'm encouraging persons to identify and name what is scaring you. What are the scary things that you dread? Sit with them, understand them, and find out what it is that you can learn from it. And sometimes question these things, because many times the things that we fear are just about future events that may never happen. And the more we can name the things that we dread, especially for an athlete, the more you can identify, okay, I'm nervous when I have to perform at this particular venue. It's the more we can work ways or create ways in overcoming them. L, the big L word has to be love. Love of self and others, being less hard on yourself and on others. But I think we are mostly hard on ourselves. Being compassionate, being understanding of our own trauma, our own pain, our own loss, because we've all experienced one or two or all of these. And if you're going to be understanding of your own pain, try to be understanding of others. Being loyal to self, another L word there, and others. And because sports looks at the collective in terms of team-based sports as well, and if we're talking about resilience from a country perspective, this is where the team comes in. Being loyal to the team even when the odds are against you, and being loyal to the team in a crisis. Now, this I is Xing out the island mentality. What do I mean by that? Islands, of course, can sustain themselves. Islands are self-sufficient. And in this case, as it relates to resilience, no man or woman is an island, and resilience removes the island mentality, which means that support is extremely important. Asking for support is even more important. And as a support expert myself, I would really want to emphasize this point of the importance of support networks. You know, there, even though support is important, I would also want to quickly add that much caution should be applied when we are providing support, because you don't want to provide too much so that people are not able to function effectively. And all have experienced trauma, pain, hurt, etc. So therefore, shared narratives come again through support can help us to find innovative ways, another I word, to overcome challenges and keep the fire ablaze and be inspired in the face of adversity. Endure is the other E in resilience. So E is for endure. Resilient people have to endure. There are just no two ways around that. The beauty about enduring is that you get evidence of completing. When there is evidence of completion, you are able to use what worked as a point of reference. So in psychology, we call this past performance using to build self-efficacy and an extension to that, collective efficacy. So if it is that we were able to endure overcoming a crisis such as this one, what are the lessons, what are the takeaways that we can now use going forward? And it should also prepare us in a way that is more positive in the event of eventualities the second time around. So enduring gives proof of completion, and completion is a great framework to know that you did it once, so you can do it again. All right. And for athletes, we just ask that you finish the race, finish the season, and if you can, finish strong. N would be for nurture, nurture gratitude, nurture good qualities that, again, provide a protective approach. In psychology, we call it benefit finding. Look for things to be grateful for. And in military terms, you can hunt the good stuff. Notice the things that you took for granted. And seeing life as a novel experience. And so it can be challenging for military personnel, especially because most of what they do can become even as well, but try to find the novel experience in life and be grateful and nurture being present, being in the moment. That is the real ordinary magic, because you would have found several instances in which you would have been resilient. C would be coming out of your comfort zone. You cannot build resilience in your comfort zone. You have to try to engage in new ways to learn things that stretch you and push you and teach you new things about yourself. And usually, unfortunately, trauma does that, loss does that, and painful situations do that as well. So learning lessons from failures, okay, you didn't win this race, you didn't do well this season. What are the things that you learned? What can you do better? What can you improve? And what do you need to learn that's new that you have not tried before? And the final E is for empower. Empower yourself and others, enlarge your resources. There are lots of resources out there. Pool together resources as well. Thriving after difficult situation, using again the individual and collective approach. Seeking out persons whose coping mechanisms you admire, learn from them, and then teach others. So in closing, resilience, R is for risk and recovering. Sorry, E is for emotional reaction. S is for strength focused. I is individual, being aware of who you are, what are your triggers, you cope as an individual. L is love, I is for Xing out the island mentality, which is really getting support, seeking support, being of support, and nurturing good qualities, on the good stuff. C, coming out of your comfort zone, and E, empowering self and each. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rose and Florence. We appreciate the sport metaphor. And I think that all of us are digging deep to find the athlete in all of us, and we will find our events of our own and hopefully finish strong. Thank you very much this morning. So, colleagues, attendees, I have been asked not to introduce the other panelists in the interest of time. And what we're going to do now is try to look at some questions that have been presented to us for our consideration around a crisis scenario that a small island state um, might be encountering. So what I'll do now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I could ask a panelist who has, if you have something to comment on the presentations that have been made before, that you just raise your hand so that you can be acknowledged. But in the meantime, what I'll do is ask our first question. Then perhaps our other panelists will comment on the questions or add something to what has been said before on those. Focus on sports, performance, spirituality, or aging. So our first question to consider is, what are the risk factors associated with the crises that our small island developing state is encountering? COVID is front and center, but we had crises before COVID and we will after COVID, as hard as it is to see beyond that frame. So we have natural disasters, we have crime, we have a range of other crises with which we have had to contend over. That there is a 2 to 3. So, I would just invite you to come in. What are the risk factors that are related to the various crises that have faced our nation over the years, and we currently do? And if you are thinking of them in terms of any priority, one relative to the other, you could go ahead and say that. So, Professor Abel, would you like to jump in now? And please, other panelists, please feel free to indicate your willingness to speak by the raising of the hand. And our lieutenant will cue us. Prof, you need to unmute or be unmuted.
Yes, your question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, risk factors in terms of what? In terms of what? In what context?
So what are the risks? So for example, many of the presentations have centered around COVID, but if you want to stay there in terms of that physical health threat, what are the risks for a nation in being resilient regarding our health? Or if you'd like to think about natural disasters, if you'd like to think about social problems, like crime, up to you. But what do you see as the risk factors that present a threat as we try to be resilient regarding health?
So I'm looking at it at different levels, at the individual level, at the family level, at the wider community level, and societal level. And I would imagine some of the risk factors at the individual level, some of the obvious one would be, for example, I think a major one is your financial status, yes? I think to a great extent, COVID has impacted on people with the lockdown and the dislocation. in terms of their affected people's finances in a significant way. We see it in terms of families, for example, who don't have access to internet and that sort of thing, and how that has impacted on the adjustment in terms of children who have to be at home studying and so on. The other issue in terms of risk factor, I would imagine, would be your own, the level of your social connection, your support system. And what we've found is that people who are more isolated and with limited social contact have found it more difficult to adjust to the period, because one of the things that occurred in the whole COVID experience is the whole need for physical distancing. We become socially disconnected. We can't do the face-to-face contact anymore. And a lot of people have had to resort to online connections. And again, this is where your socioeconomic status would have impacted. Your own emotional makeup and your coping skills, yes? Because the pandemic certainly is unprecedented. It has affected everybody. It has affected community. And more so than anything else, it has, we've been forced to dig deep in our own spiritual and psycho-emotional reserves. And what we found is that even working with persons during the pandemic, we've had to work with them to just build on their coping skills and their resilience. So, where that is limited would certainly put persons at greater risk. The wider societal, because again, the wider society has been impacted, and it's not surprising that worldwide we have seen a resurgence, an increase in protests, right, centered around Black Lives Matter. And I think part of it, apart from the events that occurred in terms of George Floyd and that sort of thing, but I think because people were under lockdown, they were dealing with a lot of the existential issues. This event became just a tipping point. Under normal circumstances, it might never have stimulated the wave of protest and so on. But I think the COVID experience, we're all in this together, lockdown, socially disconnected, have to contemplate meaning and purpose in life, which is what Marjorie alluded to earlier in terms of the existential issues that we've had to face. And I think the fact that we've had these social problems and inequities and centered around racism and so on, that and the COVID, I think, triggered a whole wave of protest, right? And I think here in Jamaica too, we've also seen a number of issues that have come before that could probably have passed over, For example, in regards to those mentally ill offenders who are in our system, right? This has been a long-term issue, but I remember even as a psychiatrist, we had to respond to it, and it was one of the first times that we ever did respond to a situation like this. And we did it because we were coping with we're dealing with the COVID issues, but we were also dealing with the wider issues in terms of racism, inequities, and so on. So the point I'm making is that a lot of these issues that have been existent at the individual level, the family level, the wider societal level, became even were exposed because of this crisis and how the pandemic really affected our lives on a daily basis. Not to mention issues around domestic violence within home, increase in terms of abuse within the home environment, which would probably have occurred in family environment where there were already issues around people persons working together, flawed communication, relationships under stress and strain.
Yes. Okay. All right. So that's quite a broad coverage of the range of risks that we are looking at Professor Abe. Thank you so much for highlighting these. We also have on the panel Colonel Powell, and also we have a representative from the Ministry of Health and Wellness. I'm going to go on to the next question. I'm hoping that the host or the person monitoring the chat will bring to me anybody who'd like to go next. But so the next question: what are the considerations for devising policy and strategy measures applicable to whole of government response across emergency scenarios? So certainly we have a pandemic, of unprecedented proportions. We've had hurricanes over the years. We have had increasingly the earthquakes and the threats that are accompanying earthquakes, violent crime. These are issues and related social problems. So one of the frameworks within which we're invited to consider the pathway to resilience, national resilience around policy, is to look at it in an integrated way. So as we think of the other panels that will focus on economics and security, and our focus on health, what are the considerations as we move towards policy and strategy measures? Let's see. I'm not seeing the raised hands. So would the representative from the Ministry of Health and Wellness like to comment at this point? Okay. Or, okay. So, Reverend Lewis, you look as if you had some ideas there. Is there something that you'd like to insert at this point, Reverend Dr. Lewis?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. I think issues around change management and conflict resolution, along with of that managing of emotions that Dr. Rose spoke about. But years ago, Alvin Toffler wrote something called Future Shock. But it feels like the last couple of years, and even more so with COVID-19, is like future shock on steroids. So it's not, you sit and you do your nice 5-year plan and it rolls out year by year. How do we cope with the changes? How do we cope with people who are risk averse or not as agile? For example, Dr. Eldemar was talking about the elderly. They like things organized and in order. So how do we plan for that? And each ministry, each department has its own way of operating, its own space. So I think the mechanisms to help resolve conflict and to manage change very rapidly are going to be critical to whatever the whole of government process is going to be.
Okay. Dr. Rose Esperance, would you like to add anything to either of the two questions? Is Colonel Powell with us?
It's on the screen?
No, man. Dr. McFarlane.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Rose.
Morning.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so the more recent question of the two is, what are we considering as we move towards devising policy and strategy measures in applicable to a whole of government response across emergency scenarios? So you could take a broad view or you could focus in on one, but what strikes you as a primary consideration as we move towards devising policy response?
Well, first of all, a primary consideration is the fact that we should be employing a holistic approach. I'm very happy for this platform where we get to discuss from the experts, what are the key areas of interest. For me, as a sports psychologist and as a psychologist in general, I think one of the critical areas is research. and the individual in terms of equipping them with different coping mechanisms so that they are able to be resilient beyond and in spite of and with additional crises that will emerge from time to time. So really it is about building resilience from an individual level first, in terms of coping mechanisms that are healthy, and then from there, networking with different support systems that we have available, whether it be spiritual support, especially, and I cannot exclude financial support. That's extremely important. But more than financial support is emotional support and equipping people with different tools that they are able to utilize on an individual basis, and then share those resources. So we take for granted the potency of just checking up on somebody, finding out how they're doing. And for me, those are the critical elements initially. And then from there, we can devise what resilient model should look like, because many times we have an idea of what we think should be without finding out from people what it is that they really need.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. As we try to integrate the policy focus in our conversation, I'm really hoping that the representative from the Ministry of Health and Wellness can be identified. As we think of the types of crises, if you think about the national disasters, we're thinking about things like national building codes. You know, what are the ways in which our policy might need to be honed in order to accommodate a more resilience stance, right? National stance. So a nation being existential in terms of our environmental and physical resilience in the face of natural disasters. How do we wrap our minds around getting these policies in place? That's a type of thinking that would help us to have a resilient policy in the face of the crises that we do face traditionally, are facing now, and can anticipate in the future. Professor, I can see that you are thinking of some responses. Yes, go ahead.
No, and I mean, in terms of your policy response, I mean, you alluded to it that we have to look at the full range of possibilities in terms of disasters and so on. And surprisingly, one of the things that the world never adequately prepared itself for was pandemic, right? And we saw it especially in some of the more developed countries, right? They probably spoke about it, but they were not adequately prepared. And in some countries where they were prepared, they disbanded their pandemic office and that sort of thing. So we have to look at the full range of possibilities. An important part of the whole policy response is that we have to do our risk vulnerability analysis. And for example, when you look, for example, in terms of our early response in the COVID, we forgot the elderly. And I remember it was Professor Shearer who stepped forward and said, hey, we have to look at this group as a highly vulnerable group, yes? Much as we're now beginning to look at, for example, other groups such as persons in nursing homes, persons in large institutions like the prisons, mental hospital, and see how, look at the vulnerability, because they are also impacted in terms of disasters and pandemic, but because they're enclosed entities, we sometimes forget about that. Yeah. In terms of the overall strategic response, and I think Jamaica has done has been good at this. The approach obviously has to be multidisciplinary, and we all must give ourselves a pattern, because in terms of our response, we've certainly included important elements such as the spiritual component and the psycho-emotional. In fact, many weeks ago, I remember I was having a discussion with Marjorie, and she said, look here, in terms of some of the responses, I noticed that the spiritual component is not highlighted enough. And when you look at it, at the core of the COVID epidemic, is that it presented for most of us a major existential crisis around death and dying, about social connections, about meaning and purpose in life. But I'm going to touch quickly in terms of the overall psycho-emotional response in times of disaster. Because there was a time when we think that the approach was to do the critical incidents debriefing, right? It's not encouraged anymore, right? What we certainly encourage is what we call psychological first aid. I just wanted to put that important point to highlight it because, and to also highlight that the majority of people are going to survive a disaster emotionally, yes, especially when it's a shared experience. And what we have to do is to emphasize the approaches that previous speakers alluded to in terms of building the resilience and coping. But just remember, majority of people come through a disaster and survive it. And as a psychiatrist, I'm not expecting to see any surge in depression, and I'm not seeing it. I'm not expecting to see any surge in suicide. Jamaica already has a low suicide rate, one of the lowest in the world, right? And we're not going to see a surge. We're not seeing any early evidence of that. What we're going to see is a lot of what we call adjustment disorder as people adjust to changes in their lives. Yes? And that is what we look out for, and that is what we deal with.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. I am told that Colonel Powell is indeed still in the group. And so, welcome, Colonel Powell. At this point, I'm going to direct to you our third question, which,
Oh, morning.
yes, okay, good morning, good morning. All right.
Right, I wanted to just piggyback, if you don't mind, on Professor, not Prof. Eldermeyer, Professor Abel's last comment.
Okay.
Right, and just quickly, just to mention the whole issue of preparedness. Certainly, Global Health Security Index report that came out late 2019 actually spoke to that. A country's readiness to respond to a pandemic or epidemic. We were actually rated 147th out of 194 countries. And in particular, all countries fell down on two critical areas, One, the protection of healthcare workers, and two, the whole issue with how we would handle persons who would be infected with a particular biological agent. They were specified which one, which now we can now say that it is COVID-19. So policy is geared to effecting change. Is what are the things that you consider when you want to effect change, as well as with administration, the whole thing about clinical expertise and training. I'm sticking to health in particular, not deviating from that. So with the whole area of policy, certainly we would have had some policies in place already, and that will clearly be dealing with the whole issue of how we practice the philosophy of medicine, how we do the practice, lower level doctrinal stuff again. So not to get or to belabor that point, but a little granular. Certainly, leadership hierarchy is critical, and you foster organizational resilience, right? You ensure that you have enough reserves of supplies, ensure that backup plans and certainly succession plans are in place. You foster a culture of flexibility, ensure that persons are adequately trained with the requisite skill sets, right? Organizational justice is another one we have to consider again. And last but not least, certainly team building by supporting collaborative interdisciplinary relationships. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you for that. We're glad that we got your input today. It's hard to see based on the layout on the screen who is here, but I noticed that Michelle Lemon is here from the Ministry of National Security. We'd love to hear from you, your input on any of these ideas, Miss Lemon. Did we lose Miss Lemon? Okay. Um, Is okay, so I am not seeing the raising of the hands. I'll just ask one last time if there's a representative from the Ministry of Health and Wellness here, as one of our panelists. Okay, so as we draw close to the 12:30 hour, okay, I'm seeing that. Okay, so I'll share with you some comments from the chat. Lisa Suarez Lewis comments that there are good points made. She says, I agree with that the world was not preparing for a pandemic and our generation did not experience one. So we were in the box of don't know what we don't know. So, wait, I lost it. I'll go back up. Right. So we or our leaders need to be very curious and share more information and data so we can devise more strategies and policies fit to our circumstances. So as I just continue to read these final comments, Prof. and other panelists, we're going to have a round of last comments after I finish reading these. So prepare your final comments. And Ms. Lewis continues, I agree we were slow on the policies to protect our frontliners. I'm on the board of SERHA, the Southeast Regional Health Authority, and we had to fast track some of the policies for protecting frontliners with personal protective gear and priority for testing. So they were confident and committed on the front line. And yes, the media did keep us aware of that challenge. And she continues, policies that break down silos also, agreeing with the speaker. We read that the China experience highlighted that the relationships between doctors and nurses suffered greatly at the start of the pandemic. And we know the importance of the patient-practitioner interaction. So she continues. So I'm glad that we are able to include these chats, and those of you who the chat is not visible to you, I hope you can go over and read the conclusion of her comments. So now I'll just go around the room and allow our panelists to give last comments on this issue of we're on the road towards resilience. Even talking about it, I think, is an example of flexing those muscles that Dr. Rose Esperance visibly portrayed to us so evocatively in her presentation slides. So first we had Professor Eldemire Sherrill. Any last comments for us, Professor Eldemire Sherrill?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity to learn and to share and to recognize that we're only at the start of this journey, especially we have hurricane season coming up. And I think it's an opportunity for us all to focus on what we're going to do in terms of disaster management. Only this morning I was thinking, okay, well, what are we doing about making sure that we have flu shots available and early for the older people for the second wave of COVID? But I think that the discussion has reinforced a lot of what people are doing, but also more importantly, allowed us to share and to have new ideas. Right. So thanks to JDF.
Right. Thank you so much. Rev. Dr. Lewis? Final comment?
Thanks to JDF and the Ministry of National Security. This has been really good. I'm happy to be part of it. I just want to emphasize that spirituality is key, to focus on the gratitude, on the positive, the strengths, to piggyback on Dr. Rose. We know all of what is wrong, but there are lots of things that are right that can help us in our resilience. I would like to challenge the government departments like health and education that do not yet have a good cadre of chaplains to work in those systems. I mean, hospital chaplains are serious business this side of the world. To look at the kinds of models we have in the Ministry of National Security, where you have paid chaplains, you have volunteer chaplains, and you have peer support. And to just emphasize that the spiritual care we're looking at is not evangelism, it's to help people to pull out what is within them. And one maxim that is in almost all the sacred books we have found is simply the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So that's my encouragement.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Professor Abel, a final word for us, sir?
You know, one of the things we have to remind ourselves is that as small as we are with our limited resources, we have demonstrated our capacity to respond. And from a Ministry of Health perspective and national perspective, we've been able to just go back to basics and use basic public health approaches that we're good at, right? And the second thing we've demonstrated is our ability to work across sectors and discipline. And I think this has sustained us to this point in time.
Yes, thank you. And yes, that cross-sector perspective is very important. We just don't want the silos. And finally, Colonel Powell, a final word from you, sir.
Thank you very much. Just 6 things I'd like to leave with the distinguished panel, and certainly on behalf of the Jamaica Defence Force to tell you all thank you. This has been very stimulating. Just 6 things: 1, prevention; 2, detection and reporting; 3, rapid response; 4, health system, and a sufficient and robust health system to treat the sick and protect health workers; 5, compliance with international norms; and the last one, risk environment. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yes, we need, so that's part B. We need another panel to pick up on that breakdown, which is a very useful framing. Thank you. So as facilitator, as we are now past the time, this would never do in the military. So I'm mindful that we had been scheduled to finish, and so we must wrap up, even though I think we're just peeling back the onion and getting into the challenge of envisioning and readying ourselves for recognizing the challenges that are inherent in responding to crises, such as our characteristic of living with a small island developing state, that we not only recognize them, but we are able to prioritize our response because of the nature of the resources that are available to us. And then that we are not only reactive, but we have an eye towards post-crisis time, right? So we elevate and marshal our resources to respond to the challenge, but then what, right? So we need a post-crisis view, as well as it is always encouraged that we are taking the long view, looking down the road, so that we are not only responsive, but we are anticipating the challenges that we face. I think that these are all valuable stances to take in light of our pursuit of resilience. So on behalf of the panelists in this discussion group, it is my pleasure. I have to thank the joint effort of the JDF and the Ministry of National Security for hosting, staging this landmark event. And I think that the panelists will agree with me that we're looking forward to more of the same. And certainly as the session, the symposium continues, we wish the organizers all the very best, and we are confident that the benefits will redound to our nation. Thank you so much, everyone.